Okay, hello kinesiology students, and welcome to another practice quiz. And this is primarily for chapter 3, but also we're going to combine some glenohumeral and shoulder joint functions with this. So let me just set up the information for this question. You have a patient, they're in the prone position on a table, and they have some dumbbells in their hands, both hands, but we can primarily just focus on the right upper extremity. And what they're doing is they're in a starting position of, we'll just say about 30 degrees of glenohumeral joint extension, and then they're slowly lowering these dumbbells down to a slight angle of flexion. So maybe we'll say about 10 degrees of flexion while keeping their elbows extended. So they're going from A to B. And I want you to think about the 4 shoulder muscles. There's more than 4 that are active with this, but if we had to pick 4 that are likely to show the highest muscle activity if measured via EMG. EMG is electromyography, and that's going to tell us how much activity, how much actin and myosin, how many contractions are happening with the electrical activity for those individual muscles. And imagine this patient has all these muscles, all types of muscles with EMG feedback electrodes on there to see what is contracting the most. And with that, I want you to think about the motion that is being performed here. So first, my guiding question for you is, which osteokinematic motion is being performed? And in particular at the glenohumeral joint, so we're looking at shoulder flexion. So they're starting in an extended position, and then gravity wants to take them into flexion. But what are they doing? They're trying to slow down or apply a force to make sure that these dumbbells don't drop really rapidly. It's a slow, controlled movement downwards. So essentially, to do this, even though they're doing shoulder flexion, gravity is doing shoulder flexion. So we need a force in the opposite direction to resist the forces of gravity. And so these are going to be accomplished by the shoulder extensors. And so with that, if we know the shoulder extensors are the ones that are going to be contracting, this is where you're just thinking back to anatomy now and think, okay, so which muscles extend the glenohumeral joint? So can you name and maybe even type all the muscles that extend the glenohumeral joint? Pause the video here if you need to. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint which shows just a summary of the beginning of the chapter for this. Okay, so here we go. This is from the chapter. Okay, so I love these charts at the beginning of each, and there's, of course, the primary movers and the secondary movers. But for sagittal plane, for extension, we're looking at 2, deltoid posterior, and latissimus dorsi. Those are going to be your main primary movers for shoulder extension. Or we could say those are the primary movers to control shoulder flexion in an eccentric manner. And then we also have some secondary movers, triceps, pectoralis, and teres. And just to distinguish, there's the sternal head and the clavicular head, which are doing actually opposite motions. So for this, though, pectoralis, the comment I would have there is that it does perform shoulder extension, but if you think about the origin and the insertion, it's primarily in a position of shoulder flexion at which it has a good line of pull to apply extension. And in an extended position, if anything, even the sternal head could contribute a little bit to shoulder flexion, which I know is a little confusing. But deltoid and lat are going to be your primary, secondary movers. Primary movers. Your secondary movers are going to be your triceps and your teres. So with that, now we'll go back here and look at these lists. And so we're looking for 2 in this column that are correct and 2 in that column that are correct. So we know the anterior deltoid does do shoulder flexion. So even though the patient is doing shoulder flexion, the anterior deltoid is not active because gravity is doing shoulder flexion. So we can eliminate the anterior deltoids. And the biceps we also know does shoulder flexion, so we can eliminate those ones. And so it leaves us with posterior deltoid and latissimus. And we know that in both of these options here, the muscle is going to be lengthening, so that's going to make you think eccentrically. So there's eccentric posterior delt and eccentric latissimus. And how about in this column? Well, here we go. We have your triceps. That's going to be a shoulder extensor. And then we have your teres major. That's going to be a shoulder extensor. Once again, they're lengthening in those activities, and going into shoulder flexion is going to lengthen a shoulder extensor. So it's going to be eccentric here and eccentric here. We're going to eliminate teres minor because we know that does shoulder external rotation. So with that, those are your answers. So here you go. I have them typed in here. Those are going to be the ones that are active with that. So those are your shoulder extensors. The other thing I'd like to add for this, and maybe you're thinking about this, for the triceps, it's going to be a two-joint muscle, so it's also crossing the elbow joint. And if you look at this position, the elbow is extended, kind of locked in full extension, and it's still locked in full extension. Gravity is going to want to bend or flex the elbow. So the triceps of the elbow has to remain in this isometric contraction throughout, going from position A to position B. So the triceps is going to be active isometrically at the elbow, but eccentrically at the shoulder. And overall, the net effect is going to be eccentric, because if the elbow stays in the same position throughout, that's going to be a net change there that's not going to be affected. And then if it lengthens at the elbow, that's going to focus on the eccentric activity. So that's why it's triceps for eccentric. So hopefully this helps to kind of put some clarification to this and connect some of the dots from anatomy and kinesiology concepts. There's some other things to practice in here, so we won't be going over these. I'd like you to work on these individually and then share your answers with your classmates. See if they got the same thing for this scenario, looking at from A to B. And then also you could take this from B to A and answer that and see how that affects the movement in the position. Here's another motion from A to B. And you could even compare this for B to A. So that's the practice activity. Hopefully that's good. Oh, wait a second. Oh, this happens sometimes. There's, one of my dad jokes kind of fits itself into the PowerPoint. I never had that happen. So what does a house always wear to a party? What does a house always wear to a party? It wears, of course, a dress. Okay, house, a dress. It wears a dress. Okay, a dress. That is the answer there. Hopefully you enjoyed this. You're all done, and you can move on to the next thing. But thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in class. Bye-bye.